So, this guy's name is Tullian. He's the lead pastor at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church in Florida. This is no small church. It's a megachurch with thousands of people filling the seats every Sunday. Tullian's leading worship, he's got his own ministry, and on the surface, it looks like he's living the perfect pastor life. But trust me, things are about to get messy. Real messy. So, let's rewind to 2015. Tullian's at the top of his game, leading his church, speaking to packed crowds. Everything seems golden. But behind the scenes, not so much. It turns out Tullian's marriage is falling apart, and one day, he finds out the unthinkable. His wife is cheating on him. Now, that's already a huge deal, right? But instead of dealing with it the way you'd expect from a pastor, like talking it out, seeking help, literally anything else, he jumps into an inappropriate relationship with a friend, and that's where it all starts to unravel. Her name is Rachel Steele. She was a member of Coral Ridge, the very church Tullian was leading. But here's where it gets really messy. Just months before this, Tullian baptized her children. He was also giving her and her husband marriage advice. So let's get this straight. He's their pastor, their spiritual leader, and the guy giving them advice on how to fix their marriage, while secretly having an affair with Rachel. Rachel trusted him completely, as anyone would trust their pastor. But that trust turned into something else when Tullian began sleeping with her. Yeah, they had a sexual relationship. And this wasn't some casual fling. Tullian was using his position as her pastor to make it happen. She even said that while she wanted to sleep with him, there was an element of her just giving in to what he wanted because of his role in her life. This wasn't just an affair between two adults on equal ground. Tullian was in a position of spiritual authority over Rachel. She was looking to him for guidance, and he used that power dynamic to manipulate the situation. It wasn't just about sex, it was about control. He was her pastor, the person she trusted with her spiritual well-being, and he took that trust and turned it into something completely inappropriate. Now, when the church found out about the affair, Tullian had no choice but to resign. But let me tell you, this wasn't some graceful exit. He was forced out. The church basically said, look, you violated the morality contract. You've got to go. And yeah, they were right. You can't lead a church when you're out here sleeping with your congregation. That's not how this works. But that's not the end of it. Nope, this was just the first affair. Because here's where things take an even darker turn. But wait, it gets worse. Because Rachel Steele's affair wasn't the only skeleton in Tullian's closet. Nope. There was another affair before that. That's right. Before the drama with Rachel even happened, Tullian was already involved with another woman. And here's the kicker. He was still married at the time. This second affair took place back in 2014, while Tullian was still preaching at Coral Ridge. And it wasn't just a one-off mistake. It was a full-on relationship that the church leaders eventually found out about. But instead of dealing with it publicly, they decided to keep it quiet. They hoped no one would find out, that the whole thing would just fade away. So now, you've got a pastor who's had two affairs, one in 2014 that the church covered up, and the one with Rachel Steele that ended up blowing the whole thing wide open. The congregation had no idea about the first affair, so when this all came to light, people were furious. Not only had Tullian been betraying his wife and his congregation, but the leadership was hiding it too. The trust was completely shattered. Now at this point, you're probably thinking, okay, this guy's clearly a mess. A pastor having two affairs while leading a megachurch? That's bad enough. But hold on, because here's where we drop the bombshell. Tullian Tchividjian isn't just any pastor. Nope. This guy is the grandson of Billy Graham. Yeah, that Billy Graham, the world-famous evangelist who preached to millions and is basically a household name in Christianity. We're talking about a man who met with presidents, led global revivals, and was seen as the moral compass for so many people. Now imagine the pressure of being Billy Graham's grandson. People expected Tullian to carry on that legacy, to be a shining example of Christian leadership. And what did he do? He blew it, with two affairs, a collapsed marriage, and a church scandal that shocked everyone. So now we've got two affairs. A megachurch pastor who was supposed to be the torchbearer for a family legacy falling from grace in the most public way possible. And it wasn't just Tullian's reputation that took a hit. His actions cast a shadow over the entire Graham name. People couldn't believe that Billy Graham's grandson could fall this hard.
Grandson of famed Pastor Billy Graham admitted to an extramarital affair before stepping down.
My grandfather, yes.
Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church was in chaos. The congregation was devastated. The leadership had no choice but to resign, and Tullian, he was completely out. No job, no church, and no future in ministry. Not long after everything blew up, Tullian tried to stage a comeback. He moved to another church, Willow Creek Presbyterian in Florida. The leadership there thought maybe, just maybe, they could give him a second chance. But guess what? They didn't know about the second affair. Tullian kept that little detail under wraps. So when the truth finally came out, Willow Creek had no choice. They fired him too. That's right, fired twice. 2 affairs, 2 firings, and a pastor who went from the top of the Christian world to rock bottom. And rock bottom wasn't just about losing his job. Tullian went through a really dark time after all of this. He admitted that he thought about ending his life. He felt like there was no way out of the mess he'd made. He'd lost his career, his marriage, his reputation, and his family's legacy. At one point, he wrote a suicide note, convinced that this was the end. That's how low things got for Tullian. And no matter how badly someone screwed up, it's hard to hear about someone hitting that level of despair. But somehow, he survived. He made it through that dark period and started rebuilding his life. In 2019, Tullian launched a new church called The Sanctuary in Florida. This was supposed to be a fresh start, a place for broken people to break down and for fallen people to fall down. In other words, a place for people like him who had hit rock bottom and were looking for redemption.
We moved here to create a place for people like us. People who were well acquainted with failure and loss and disappointment and sadness and guilt and this sense of not measuring up. People who are well acquainted with shame and regret and grief and struggle and consequences and death and sorrow and lostness. We came to create a place for people like us. We didn't come here to start a church for Christians.
Tullian's using his own story of failure to preach about grace and forgiveness. He's trying to turn his mess into a message about second chances. And the thing is, some people are buying it. His church has a following, and they believe in his message of redemption. All right, let's take a step back for a moment because Tullian's story isn't an isolated case. It seems like every few years we hear about yet another high-profile pastor caught in a sexual scandal. I mean, just look at the list. Bishop Eddie Long, Earl Hall, Jim Bakker, Bill Hybels, Carl Lentz, Jimmy Swaggart, Ravi Zacharias, Jerry Falwell Jr., Jeremy Foster, Brian Houston, Robert Morris, and most recently, Steve Lawson. That's a lineup of some of the most influential pastors in modern Christianity, and they all fell into sexual sin. So why? How is it that these anointed, renowned leaders who seem so strong in their faith keep falling into the same trap? The truth is, sexual sin is one of the most powerful temptations, and it's something even the strongest leaders can struggle with. There's power, secrecy, and a sense of entitlement that comes with being in a position of spiritual authority. And when those boundaries get blurred, people, no matter how spiritual they are, fall into it. Pastors aren't immune. They're human, just like the rest of us. But the consequences of their fall are felt by their families, their congregations, and the wider Christian community. The ripple effects are huge. But here's the thing. Just because someone is tempted and falls doesn't mean they can still lead a church. According to the Bible, pastors are held to higher standards because they're responsible for guiding others in their faith. And when you break those standards, you disqualify yourself from leading spiritually. 1 Timothy Chapter 3, verse 2 is pretty clear about the qualifications of a pastor, or overseer, as it says here. They're supposed to be above reproach, faithful to their wife, and self-controlled. Tullian, by having multiple affairs, not only broke the trust of his congregation and his family, but also failed to meet these basic biblical standards. That's not just a slip-up, that's a disqualification. Being in a leadership position means you're held to a higher bar. And when that bar is broken, like in Tullian's case, you can't just go back to the pulpit and act like everything's fine. It's not. He violated the very principles he was supposed to uphold. Other pastors who've fallen into sexual sin have stepped down and stayed out of ministry, recognizing that their actions disqualified them from leading a church. But Tullian, he's trying to come back as if nothing happened. And that's where the real issue lies. Can someone who's violated the trust of their congregation in this way ever truly regain the moral authority to lead? So, here's the question. Can trust ever be fully restored once it's broken? The Bible says that pastors must be above reproach, meaning their behavior should never bring shame or dishonor to the church. Tullian's actions brought shame not just to himself, but to his entire congregation and his family. That's a heavy burden to carry. Sure, There's grace, and forgiveness is always possible. But does forgiveness mean you can go right back to the same leadership position you had before? Or are some actions so disqualifying that you need to step aside permanently? And here's what we need to remember. It's not just about Tullian. When a pastor falls into sin, the entire church community is affected. The congregation looks to their pastor as a spiritual guide, someone who sets the example. When that trust is broken, the damage goes way beyond just the individual. It fractures the entire church. So, what do we do with this? Tullian is back in ministry, leading the sanctuary, and preaching about grace and redemption. But can he really lead a congregation again after violating the very standards he preached about? Can he regain the trust he lost? Or is it time for him to step back, permanently disqualified from the role of pastor because he's broken the biblical qualifications? Let me know what you think in the comments.